From the studios in Joplin, Missouri, Good News Productions International presents Venture in Faith. Outstanding Christians of our generation telling their own story of how God has worked in their lives. Your host, Boyce Moten.
Hello. Our guest today is Eugene Morse, a veteran missionary to Southeast Asia, and I'm going to be putting him in an awkward position today because I'm going to be asking him to talk a lot about himself. And as a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ, he has spent his life talking about others and about the Lord. But Eugene, the Bible teaches in John chapter 7 and verse 18, he that speaks of himself seeks his own glory. And we know that Jesus was not speaking about himself, he was talking about God. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this session of Venture in Faith. We're going to be talking about God at work in your life and the lives of your family. I want to begin by making reference to a book which was published initially by the Reader's Digest. It's titled Exodus to a Hidden Valley. It was condensed in the February 1974 issue of the Reader's Digest. Some 31 million people around the world in a variety of different languages read a condensation of this story. The Reader's Digest books have been sold out, and I understand there have been a number of other editions, Eugene?
Yes, about 3 or 4 editions now.
There have been 3 or 4 editions of the book Exodus to a Hidden Valley, and this particular edition by Collins World is virtually sold out, and at the present time we might say the book is out of print and unavailable.
There's just a few copies left now.
Very, very few copies left, and we're hoping and praying, of course, that God will see to it that the book is again put in print. Now, Eugene, in order for our viewers who may not be familiar with the Morse family, and there are some perhaps who may be seeing you for the very first time, tell us a little bit about yourself and your family, and then later on we'll get back to the book and your 6 years in Hidden Valley.
When I was just a child, well, a baby actually, my father and mother went out as missionary recruits to Central Asia, to Tibet, recruited by Dr. Albert L. Shelton under the United Christian Missionary Society. My father and mother continued there for 5 years and learned...
What year was that, Eugene?
1921.
It was in the year 1921.
Yes. And they continued there for 5 years learning Chinese and learning Tibetan, which they really got very well. They were very much interested and concerned about evangelism, but due to the liberal trend of the mission board, after 5 years they just decided to resign from the mission board there in Central Asia. Now, normally speaking, they should have come home to the States and then set up their support base and then gone out again. But instead, they felt that the Lord was leading them to start the new work before coming back to the States. So they resigned in the middle of Asia without any support base, trusting the Lord for all their support. Now, I think that you could say that they took the Lord's promises and seek ye first the kingdom of heaven and his righteousness, and all these things shall be given to you. The Lord has promised to take care of the logistics if we take care of of his work.
Their venture in faith is more dramatic than even appears on the surface. Of course, they went miles and miles and miles away from doctors and anything that we would call modern vehicles. I think I've heard your father say that for some 30 years you labored without even a wheeled vehicle of any kind.
That's exactly right. For 30 years we didn't even have a bicycle to use.
But just a very short while after your father and mother, who were pioneers in this new area with you, a 4-month-old baby, just a few months after they got on the field, the man who was their mentor and helper was killed by Tibetan bandits?
That's right. Just a few months after he arrived on the Tibetan border, Dr. Shelton was ambushed by bandits. And actually, as he died, my father was there, and you might say that his mantle fell upon my father. in a sense like Elijah's mantle fell upon Elisha to carry on the work. So in a very real sense, my father carried on the work begun by Albert Shelton.
Albert Shelton was a medical doctor.
Yes, he was.
Your father was not.
Although he was not an actual medical doctor, yet my father was very much interested in medicine and did medical work for about 40 years.
How many people would you suppose he treated during the 40 years as a missionary?
We'd have as many as 80 to 100 patients every day when we were in North Burma. So we have no idea.
They say in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man becomes a king. And your father, though he was not a registered medical doctor, in terms of what we would think of in the United States, he treated all of these patients and in every kind of illness because there was no other doctor.
The nearest hospital would have been a month's travel by horseback away. And of course, he was the only doctor then, except maybe native herbal doctors that might be...
Witch doctors?
Witch doctors. Well, then they also had herbal doctors, which in a way they did help somewhat, but my father was so successful that people would, in later years, would actually bypass a government hospital to come to him.
Now, Eugene, as reluctant as you are to talk about yourself, during this session, I want to do just that. You were 4 months old when you went to Tibet.
That's right.
And you couldn't speak any language at that time. What was your first language to learn?
Being surrounded by all the native people there in Tibet, well, of course, Tibetan was our first language. And English was just another language that spoke to your parents alone, but we were most fluent in Tibetan. And then after we left the Tibetan work, after about when I was six years old, we came down to the China side, and Chinese then became our next major language, which we mastered as our home language.
This program is being videotaped in 1980, and we hope that it's going to be used for many, many years. But the thing I want to point out is that from 1921 to 1980 is a period of
59 years.
59 years. How many of those years have you spent here in the United States of America?
Trying to figure it all up month by month, I think not more than 10 years.
Not more than 10 years.
It was between 9 and 10 years.
So virtually all of your life,
that's right,
you have been in Asia. And
yes.
at the present time, well, in just a few days, you're going to be going back to Thailand, where you're presently working for the Lord.
That's right. We've been in Thailand since 1972. My wife and most of our children are out there at present. Only 2 of our children are here in the States.
Eugene, tell me about your first visit to the United States of America.
In 1927, after we had resigned from the mission board, came down to start this new work, Civil War had broken out in China and we had to evacuate. So in 1927, we evacuated out through the jungles of North Burma, taking 70 days trekking through during the monsoon rainy season. And we wondered at times whether we'd ever get out alive. It was an area that white people had never gone through before. And we came out finally down through to Fort Hertz, down to Myitkyina in North Burma. And from there, then we continued on out, coming through Europe, visiting in Palestine, Egypt and Greece and Rome and England, and that's the only time I've ever made that trip through there. It was 1927, and we arrived in the United States. It was during the big, just before the Depression, I'd say.
Roaring 20s.
Roaring 20s, I guess, and things were going strong. We were in the States for 2 years, and my father took a 1-year missionary medical training course at that time. So we continued our education here. We were here 2 years, and my father finished his 1-year medical course, and so by 1929, about the summer of 1929, then we started back to our new work on the China-Burma border in the extreme upper reaches of the Mekong, Salween rivers.
You know, I'm thinking of a section in this book which talks about your false imprisonment in, was it Mandalay?
Yes.
And Marilyn, your daughter, was 16 years old at the time and had never seen the inside of a restroom. And she was wondering how she was going to bathe. Some what was it, a British consulate, or somebody was going to take her out of the jail. Children have no business being in jail, even in Burma. And it occurred to you as a family that she had been born also over there in Asia, and the bathing had all been done in the river, and the women, in an attempt to be modest, would take along, what do you call
the sarong or longji?
The longji, the sarong, this wraparound. They'd go out and bathe, and she wanted to take this when she went with his family, and he said, well, you don't need that, because, and you had to explain to her what a restroom was.
They were really quite shocked to say, what you do, bathe naked? They said, well, of course in a bathroom, of course that's the way you do, but out there, why, nobody bathes in that way. They're always covered up with the longji.
So it's hard for people who know the Morse family to realize that even though you speak good English, and even though you're fair-skinned and round-eyed, you're more Asian than you are American, well, more Christian than you are either. Our citizenship is in heaven.
Well, in a sense, this is a great advantage to us in Asia, because we have really truly been able to identify with the people out there, and actually by being able to think as they do, identify with them, being one with them, we were able to help them much more. And when problems came up in situations, why, we were able to counsel with them, to sympathize with them, help them, and in many respects, I think we were far more useful in the Lord's work in that way than newcomers who all the time trying to compare with the American way of doing things.
Eugene, I think we could conservatively say that a dozen books much larger than this could be written about the Morse family and your work in Asia and not tell the whole story.
That's true.
But would you now, for our viewers, talk in particular about this most famous experience of the Morse family, the 6 years which you spent in Hidden Valley?
Yes. During the World War II, we had stayed on for 9.5 years and helped the Air Force in search and rescue work. Now, many of the planes and all were flying over from India to China across this northern Burma area, crossing that first range which between India and Burma, and then the second range across from Burma to China. And at the end of the war, we were granted letters of commendation from the Air Force, General Arnold of the American Air Force, and from the Air Transport Command and so on. Well, anyway, we went back out then at the end of the Second World War, well, in 1949, just before China fell to the communists, and so then we evacuated to cross over to Burma. Well, thousands of Christians went with us at the same time and evacuated over into Burma, and with their help, well, we evangelized the whole of North Burma to the extent where probably 80% of the total population have become Christians, both among Lisu tribes, the Rawang tribes, as well as many among the Naga tribes and a few among the Kachin. Now, the work had grown at this time to somewhere around between 30 and 40,000. But in 1963, 62, 63, the government turned to a socialist government, and the army took over and trying to impose a Marxist-oriented government. So immediately there was all kinds of guerrilla warfare breaking out, and many of the people, seeing that this was another turn towards communism, the Lisu people especially, who had evacuated from China, were in very great jitters, and they were just about ready to flee westward into India. But we said, well, let's hold on as long as we can. So from 1962 to 1965, the Lisu Christians were increasingly jittery, wanting to leave, but we just kind of held on, and we continued to minister, holding Bible schools under extreme difficult conditions. The Rawang people, being Burma-oriented, and many of their leaders in the government, more or less stayed on the government side and sided with the government. The Kachins were very anti-socialist, anti-communist, and they formed a Kachin Independence Army. But the Kachin people tried to recruit all the people to join them. Now, obviously, we had the choice of the government side, the socialism, and the Kachins were anti-communist, anti-socialist, at least at that time they were. So the Lisu were caught between. Obviously, the Lisu sympathies were anti-communist, so there was a tendency to side with the Kachins. However, the Lisu did not want to get involved in any civil war type of thing, so they tried to remain neutral.
Let me interrupt and bring this point out. You had been there how many years at this time?
From 1950 to 1965, 15 years.
You've been 15 years in this particular area?
Yes.
And what had I know that you had planted a lot of fruit trees. Tell us a little bit about some of the changes which had come as a direct result of Christians working in the area.
Well, when we first came to that area, the area was, the Putao Plains were virtually uninhabited. It was practically like a death valley. All the Christians were up in the hills to the east and on the China border and up in the mountains. So when we first came in there in 1950, the Lisu people started moving down, and we instituted a anti-malarial campaign or spraying program. And then my father started introducing fruit trees. Friends gave us some money to buy a tractor, and we opened up a lot of the grasslands for farming. We also laid out model villages. We worked with the government in laying out new roads and bridges, and it was just a total development program. In the meanwhile, of course, we in the villages, my brother Laverne helped to start Christian day schools. Robert worked on the translation of the New Testament into the Rawang language using a script which he himself had developed too. And so that worked.
They didn't even have a written language.
No, they didn't have any written language before. So he developed the written script and then translated the New Testament and printed that. And so there was an agricultural program, a fruit tree growing program, there was a Christian day school program, there was literacy, Bible production programs, and then of course to top it all, we had Bible schools, 3 months of short-term Bible schools every year, training the Lisu leadership and the whole church. And so the work just grew on every hand. Actually, I would say it's one of the most exciting opportunities for development of a totally backward area and bringing it up into on a par with modern conditions.
I'm thinking of the vision of Ezekiel causing the desert to blossom like a rose.
And in fact, at the present time, just this last year, the head of the Burmese government proclaimed Putao in our area there as being the most prosperous, the most peaceful area in the whole of Burma. And we thought that was a real tribute to the work that we had done.
But the bottom line is that the Marxists did not like you. They were afraid of you.
Well, in fact, the Chinese hated us so much that they tried to put pressure on the Burmese government to get us out of that area. But the Burmese officials, especially those of the Kachin state, that's the northern Burma state where we were, stood up and said, we don't like your meddling in our affairs. What we do in our own country is our own business, and so they really stood up for us, and it was possible then for us to continue all right to the end. Right to the end. But you did get how much notice? 24, 48 hours? Well, actually, finally in 1965, around December the 3rd, I think it was, that the letter came through from the central government of Burma and passing over the state government and coming through directly like that, ordering us to leave. And they said that we had to be out of the country by the December 31st. Well, of course, now that gave us just barely a little over 3 weeks. And in order to terminate all our work and pack up everything and do all that, it was just almost impossible. And then the thousands of people that came every day to see us and to talk to us, and we had to comfort them and counsel them, and at the same time get ready. It was really a terrible time of stress and strain. Now,
we're going to be talking about God at work, and under normal circumstances, the American missionaries would have been put on an airplane and flown out of the area in a matter of a few hours. But it didn't work that way. You tell us why.
Because the Lord saw that we had to finish the work that we had there. Actually, as we were preparing, we were ready to go out by air if necessary, but in the meanwhile, we were praying about it, and all the people were begging us, says, don't leave us, we're going out into the jungle across to India, and please come with them. So we were torn between the two decisions.
Of course, Grandma Esther played a part in this too.
Right. And she was pregnant and was expecting a baby in just a few weeks. And so we applied to the government to give us an extension of time for her sake. And the doctor who was in charge there was a very anti-Christian Marxist doctor, and he absolutely refused. In the meanwhile, some of the kids got smallpox, or not smallpox, chicken pox and mumps. And so we asked the airlines pilots if what about this, and they said, well, until that was cleared up, they wouldn't be able to go out of the country. Well, we applied for an extension of time, and it actually applied through the American Embassy to the top officials in Rangoon. The word came, and in the meanwhile, we were praying, Lord, do you want us to go out by air, or do you want us to go out with through the plea of all Christians for us to not abandon them, but to go with them? And so should we go with them? So as we left it to the Lord to determine. Well, when the word came back by telegram saying the time could not be extended, then we knew then that we couldn't go out by air, we had to go out by land, and so we immediately, within hours, we notified the folks. Oh, there were several thousand people up in the mountains waiting for us to join them. So we told them, okay, come and get us. And so the very next night, which was a Wednesday night, on the 23rd, we left and went out, started the trek out overland, going with these thousands of Christians. Well, while we were up in the hills, there was 2,000 to start with, but while we were up there in the hills, another 3,000 joined us, so that the final group that gathered at the Indian border were close to 5,000.
Now, initially, you were going to go from point A to point B. You were going to leave, the Putao Plains and go into India.
There was a Lisu village of refugees that had fled from China, had not been able to be allowed to stay in Burma, and they had already gone across the border to the India side in an area that was uninhabited. And later the Indian government found them there, declared them to be original settlers, and so they had been able to stay on, 150 families. So this new group was planning to go across and join them in this new area. But while we were waiting there at the border, while the Indian government said, no, you cannot come over and join these people, the border is sealed. And so here we were, 5,000 of us, waiting at the border for about 2 months for permission to go on and join these other former refugees that had already crossed there. Now, these were all related, of course. The people already on the India side had, because of their prior settling in there, they had gained Indian government recognition, but the government wasn't about to allow any newcomers to join them. So we had a major problem there, what to do. Well, in the meanwhile, the Lisu people, who are well acquainted with these hill areas, said, well, there's an area just this side of the border, completely cut off from, uninhabited, completely cut off. It's a hidden valley, and we could just go over and settle in that area because there's plenty of good land. Actually, it's even a better place than the area on the India side. So then it was decided at that time to go around the border, this tongue of India, Indian territory, go around the border of that and go over to this hidden valley area.
Now, all of this, you talk about a nice valley and a nice place to live. That's all relative because it was nothing nice from my perspective. I remember hearing Drama Esther tell about the birth of her baby on the trail, and she said one day they found the baby sucking on a leech. The baby was born, 2 weeks or something like that, after you were forced out of the Putao Plains at a place called Elephant.
Yes, it's
Elephant Crossing. Or?
Yes, it's a little hard to translate into English, but it's the place where the elephants. It was so steep that when the elephants climb up that, while the elephants would hit their head right into the hill above
gouge
them.
their tusks
Yes.
into the side of the mountain,
Yes.
and that's where this little baby was born, miles from a doctor or anything sanitary like a hospital. And tell us just a little bit about leeches, which was a common problem that you had during your years in the jungle.
First, about the birth of the baby. My wife is a registered nurse, and she had specialized in midwifery too. So she took care of it. But in the jungles, we do have a lot of leeches. In fact, in some areas, practically every leaf would have a leech hanging from the underside of it, waiting to take on anybody going by. So quite often you go dash through the jungle for maybe a block or so, and you pick up 100 leeches, and it was really bad. One of the dangers, of course, is if you're carrying a baby and so on. One child actually had a leech, and then it got in its eye, and before it was discovered, of course, it was great, but it sucked a lot of blood, and the child's eye was red for weeks afterwards because of that leech. Because when the leeches bite, they inject some kind of serum that causes the blood to anticoagulant, keeps the blood from
coagulating. Yeah.
Coagulating. So and then in other cases, why the leech, in this particular case, had gotten in the child's mouth, and another child, and the child, of course, not knowing any better, was just kind of sucking away, and the mother stopped and looked at it, and it kept sucking away, and opened its mouth and found this great big leech in its mouth, and the child was just sucking away on the leech, and just thinking it was kind of, because the more the leech gets bloated with the blood, why it gets bigger and bigger, and so the child then in turn was just sort of tonguing the leech there and sucking on the leech. So it was kind of a shocking situation.
And you'd have to scrape yourselves to get rid of these leeches?
Generally, the lisu, when they're running through the jungle, they would draw up their pants legs clear up as high as they can, and then they'd just go through, and then every so often they'd stop and take out their knife and scrape off the leeches, and sometimes it'd be by dozens and so on. And that was the quickest way to take them off, but of course it left their legs all just kind of streaming with blood, so it was kind of a bloody sight to see with all these leeches being scraped off. And then once the legs get bloody, well, of course the smell of the blood attracts more leeches, and so it's a mess.
So when you talk about a nice place to live, like Hidden Valley, I want everybody to know that it's not nice by American standards by any stretch of the imagination.
It was all just kind of rolling hills between 3,000 and 5,000 foot altitude. It was more or less virgin jungle with plenty of wild game, elephant herds. One herd was between 70 and 90 elephants. Another one was between 15 and 20 elephants. There was other kinds of wild game like monkeys and various kinds of deer. There was plenty of fish in the streams. There was an awful lot of wild honey in the cliff bees in the mountains. And in that respect, as far as the Lisu people are concerned, they considered it as being virgin territory, wonderful for settling in. The land was not too steep, so they were able, and it was quite fertile, so they were able to cut the jungle and plant fields. But after living there for about 5-6 years, the land was beginning to get depleted, and then after about 8 years, why the people had to begin to look for new land, and they started moving on westward. At the present time, more than half of them have moved on down to the westward, down to the some plains in the area called Hukong Valley, closer to the Naga land. And from there, why they're beginning to do some real evangelistic work among the Naga people.
Okay, now you had originally intended to be just a few weeks on the trail, and you wound up a few years without being able to go to a grocery store or supermarket and buy anything. And there was a period of time when starvation became a very real possibility, and you had to eat a jungle staple called atu.
Right.
Would you describe that, please?
No matter how much you may plan ahead, you do well if you can carry enough rice and other foods to last you more than 2-3 months. So by March, why we were beginning to get pretty badly pinched for food, and of course all the native folks too. Well, by March, this jungle food had not come in yet. What I mean to say, it's not ripe. It isn't until about late May and June that you can make use of these certain kinds of foods. So in the meanwhile, while they were living off of mushrooms and various kinds of leaves and other kinds of foods, which really were not very good, not sufficient, and so there was a time of extreme hunger there for about 2 months, and at that time many of them got discouraged. In fact, were really almost desperate. However, they were able to get some food from this Lisu community across the border, which of course the Indian government was trying to keep us separated, but they'd go over at night time and beg off food from the Lisu community that were over there And through this, they were able to get by. But I'd say maybe a third to a half of the people finally gave up and started back to Putao along about April. However, they just had barely gone back. Then the rains came, and this huge supply, this almost unlimited supply of the atu, which is a tree fern, this began to become available. What it is, it's a tree fern, kind of a fern family, but it grows as like a tree. It's about, it would be anywhere from 6 inches up to a foot in diameter, and maybe 15 to 20 feet high. And they would cut down these trees, chop them into short lengths, take off the outer bark, and the inside core is a sort of a pulpy, starch-bearing material. And they would then pound this stuff up out in the jungle. They'd make up a sort of a raised platform covered with banana leaves, and they would use their knives and mallets and so on to smash up this core, the inner core of this palm trunk, and then they leave it out there in the jungle, kind of just a mass of pulp like that. Leave it out there in the jungle for the rain to wash away all the sharp acid sap. And in the meanwhile, the heat during May and June would be warm enough that it would begin to ferment. And the fermentation process caused the breaking down of the cellulose, and so that it would become digestible. In the meanwhile, the whole thing was just one big fermenting pile filled with...
Like compost, with flies and...
Yes,
insects
and various
crawling
kinds
all
of
over.
insects and so on. And of course it would attract all kinds of jungle insects and bugs and worms and so forth. But the idea is to try to pick those out, and then when it was ready, after about 2 weeks to 3 weeks, they would get this material carried back home in the big baskets, lined baskets, and run it through a sieve. Well, now the sieve would be to take out all the splinters and fibers from the original trunk, and so that the material came out as a pancake mash. And
but it's eating compost, as far as...
Well, that's about it, yes. That's true. However, as we know that many kinds of foods do have to run through a sort of a fermentation process to make it edible. In fact, in a sense, even bread, when you put yeast in it, the yeast causes the flour to change in a texture so that it becomes digestible and edible in some way.
You're a positive thinker, you know.
But
here
of
you are
course,
eating compost, and you had prayed to God, if we can't get what we like to eat, then change our appetite so that we'll like what we do have to eat.
that has been really one of our slogans. It says, if you can't get a meal to suit your taste, get your taste to suit your meal, and
Eugene,
all kinds of foods.
We're virtually out of time. I want you to take just a couple of 3 minutes, and I don't know whether you can do it in that time or not, and tell us how the Reader's Digest found out about you and how they came to print your story.
Well, when we first came out, and we were there in Thailand, and we were there about a month, and we're getting dental work done and kind of just resting and kind of get caught up with civilized ways. And my brother was had gone up to visit a town in North Thailand by the name of Chiang Mai, and my father and mother and the rest of us had come on back to the States. Well, it seemed that some of these roving reporters, first of all, I think it was the Los Angeles Times or Examiner, had come by, and they'd kind of heard about our story. They'd gone up and interviewed my brother, and so they had put out an article in the Los Angeles Times. Well, the Reader's Digest apparently saw this article and said, hey, well, maybe there's an interesting story here. So they sent their editor, one of their roving writers, who was in Bangkok, to go up and interview my brother in Chiang Mai. Well, after talking with my brother, he says, well, it looks like that there really is a story here. And so he sent back word to their Reader's Digest headquarters, and who in turn assigned one of their editors here to come down and meet with us in Terre Haute, Indiana, and then here in Joplin. So they made one trip and interviewed us, and they said, well, this really needs to be written up. And so then the second time, then a second man came, and so that they came down and they carried out a tape recorded about 80 hours of interviews with all members of our family. Some of us in Terre Haute, some of us here in Joplin, and my father and mother down in Tulsa. And so with that 80 hours of interviewing, then they started to put together a story. However, their first draft was very, very poor. It just wasn't the way we'd like it, and so we started working with them. In fact, they invited us to come up to New York, and so Robert, my brother, and one other went up there and talked with them, and then later my wife and I went up there, and so we practically rewrote the whole thing. And then from that time onwards, while my wife, various ones of us working together, of course, but I would say my wife Helen was the chief editor, working with the Reader's Digest editors in putting together a story. Well, after they got it written, of course, then they made the condensation, which was printed in the Reader's Digest magazine. And then the original story, the book story, well, then they also printed as a book. But although without this help, without this advice and help from them, I don't think it would ever have gotten written. But they're giving us their expertise. And then on the other hand, my wife is very much interested in writing, and so Helen worked with them for a whole year, and sometimes rewriting whole chapters or whole sections. And they accepted that, and so we finally got into a shape that we felt was chronologically correct, also that the story was exactly as we wanted it to be, and of course at the same time editing out anything that might be objectionable to the Indian government or to the Burmese government, or which might cause any repercussions to various ones. And so we put together the story that way. And we feel that we're really deeply indebted to the Reader's Digest because it was a 50-50 project with them.
Now, our viewers will be able to go back into the 1974 issue, go to the local library someplace, and it's the February 1974 issue. They can read the condensation, and we're hoping that the book is going to be reprinted so that thousands and millions of more people will be able to share this venture of faith with Eugene Morse and other members of his family. Eugene, we're down to just a couple of minutes, and I want you to look into our camera and into the eyes of perhaps an aspiring young missionary couple, maybe someone who is old and in a nursing home and discouraged, and you share with them your experience in faith and encourage them in the Christian life.
I believe that we could say this way, just as the Lord Jesus spoke to Peter when he was out there walking on the waters, and says, come out, come to me. And Peter took that step by faith and stepped out on the waters, trusting the Lord, and he was able to walk on the waters. And I believe that this is the lesson that we have learned, that as we take the Lord Jesus Christ into our working with him, take his promises at face value, step out by faith. If we're willing to commit our whole life to him, that he will fulfill his part of the promise. He will bless, and you will experience some of the most fantastic answers to prayer, loving care, personal relationship, walking with the Lord, as you look back and you'll see how marvelously the Lord is able to do great and mighty things. Some of us may think that Jesus did such mighty things back in the days of the New Testament, but let me tell you that he is alive and well right now, and he's walking with us, and that the Lord Jesus is, if it wasn't for his help, his care, and his working through us, we would never accomplish what we had. So I would definitely say what has been accomplished is not what we have done, but what the Lord has done through us. And it's the the willingness to take up the cross, denying ourselves and following him, despite all dangers along the way, wars, civil wars, international wars, fires, floods, hunger and sickness, everything still just continuing day by day as the Lord leads, committing your whole life to the Lord and trusting Him to work everything out. It's your availability that the Lord wants. It's not what you can do. It's not your own personal ability. It's not anything special in your personal worth, but it's your availability and willingness to commit your whole life to the Lord and let Him work out His will, His plan through your life. And as we become available to the Lord, totally and completely committed to Him, that He is going to be able to do far greater than you ever imagined. And I believe that this is the secret of my father's work, my generation's work, our children's work. We are 3 now, coming on to 4 generations. The secret of our work is that we have been willing to follow the Lord all the way, being available to Him despite every kind of danger, physical inconvenience, and problems. Just looking to the Lord for all our needs. Here am I, Lord, send me. And this is the plea I give to you, the challenge I give to you. Are you willing to go all the way with the Lord? Are you available? If you are, the Lord can do mighty things. God bless you.
Thank you.